have Mr. Ashwajit Singh, who's just joined us. He is the founder and managing editor, IPE Global. Welcome to the show, Mr. Singh.
Thank you, Abhishek.
Your initial comments, what do you think of the budget?
I think it's a positive budget. Overall, I'm quite happy with the budget, and it's not really a budget just for the year. I think it's more a statement of intent for the next 5 years, because if you look at some of the schemes or the announcements that have been made, they're really not just sort of looking at 1 year. They're looking at whether it's jobs or employment. The schemes that they announced is going to be running over the next few years. Whether it's mainstreaming women and looking at that's again going to be running over the next few years. So I think it's very much in line with the Viksit Bharat. The focus has clearly been on this being an inclusive budget. So you're really looking at whether it's the people affected by poverty. They're very well covered in this. You're also covering tribals and Northeast, which is part of being an inclusive budget. You're looking at the youth. Youth has been actually at the prime and the central of this budget, and I think that was a huge problem, because you had a lot of people who were graduates, but they were not employable. The government of India's own schemes around skills, etc., were not really working that well because they were perhaps not being monitored well enough. You've also got the Annadata, the agriculture and the rural part of India has been looked at, and of course Nari. So you're really looking at Gyan, and here I'm particularly pleased with announcements around the jobs and employment, because of course there are discussions around whether this figure of 1 crore people being given internships is doable or not by 500 companies. Maybe not in the first year itself, but it's definitely a step in the right direction. It's really looking at some of the support that the government would have otherwise been giving through their skills mission, or even through some of the direct benefit transfers that they would have been giving to these youths. That's really now being channelized through the top 500 companies, who are not only going to be giving internships to these people, but will make sure that they are being productively used. I think that's the big advantage of attaching them to the private sector. The finance minister had, in one of her earlier statements, said that we've done what we had to as far as jobs are concerned. This was, I think, yesterday for the economic survey. Now it's time for the private sector to step in. And this is a prime example of that combination happening. The other positive thing here is that the private sector has also been allowed to use part of their CSR to support this.
Yeah, that's a very interesting point.
Yeah, that's very interesting, because earlier, and we do a lot of work for private sector in the CSR space, and more often than not, the private sector either has not been judicially using their CSR, or have always wanted to use that CSR funding directly or indirectly, which would have a positive impact on their business. And they were finding it difficult to exhaust their entire CSR in something that would have a positive impact on the business. This would have a positive impact on the business. The other thing that this internship scheme will really be, somebody asked me on another channel that do you think they are 1 crore, where are they going to be employed? Now, I don't think that there are going to be too many interns being employed at the head offices and the corporate offices of these 500 companies. They would probably be more in the regional or the state offices or the block offices, and that would really mean that especially the companies which are FMCG out of this, or which have a reach into the interiors, they are going to be using these people to create the demand. So you've really got a situation where you've provided income to these people, and at the same time they in turn are creating demand, which is the rural demand is something that's the consumption and demand's been affecting us in any case.
Right. So we've been talking about addressing that side of demand, because on one hand you have increased demand of luxury goods, and at the bottom of the pyramid, of course, talking about the rural economy and tier 2, tier 3 towns and smaller cities and villages, skewed in that sense. So some great points that you've raised there. But one thing which I specifically wanted to talk to you about is, of course, the infra sector.
See, the infrastructure sector, the government's already sort of clearly last government itself had demonstrated their intent about infrastructure. They had committed 10 lakh crores into infrastructure. You have seen a lot of money actually gone into infrastructure, be it road, be it railways, be it connectivity. We've seen that happen. This year again, they've committed 11 lakh crores. So I think it's also now time for them to leverage the private sector funding here. And this is where I would say that
for some reason, despite government's best efforts, the private sector investment hasn't risen, at least in the manner and to the extent that the government was expecting.
Absolutely. No.
But we will talk about it. We will talk about it at a later stage. At this point in time, of course, this being the foundational budget, now that it's out, now that the cat is out of the bag.
Just coming here, the finance minister in 2022 spoke about blended finance as a concept for getting in private sector investment. Not much has happened since then. So I think it's time for them to really revisit blended finance, because to me, that will be a combination of the government as well as private sector and banking money coming in. A lot of that could go into infrastructure. A lot of that could go into innovation, be it climate, health, or agri.
All right. Now, to wrap this up, let me ask all of you here, one after another. Let me start with Mr. Doshi, and then, of course, I'll go to Mr. Soni. What kind of a budget has it been? And out of 5, what's the rating that you're going to give to this budget? Mr. Doshi, let's start with you.
I think overall it's a good budget in terms of intent and direction. I would give it 4 on 5. 4 on 5 because it touches upon all the things that are going to impact the direction of our economy. It talks about structural reforms. It talks about all the factors of production ranging from land, labor, capital, infrastructure, power, and it keeps on the path of fiscal consolidation. I would deduct that 1 point for not being bold enough on some of the more difficult things. So there is no, for example, intent on labor reforms, which is an urgent need for labor-intensive manufacturing. On the customs duties reduction, there are some cosmetic announcements around electronics and phone, but it's largely been pushed out in the future. Currently, there is no meaningful rationalization of duties on input. So a couple of the factors of reduction will remain tough. But at least the government has talked about them, and therefore we can see the intent, waiting for the details. So 4 on 5.
All right. Mr. Soni, your comments. But before that, actually, I have one more question for you. And that is, can people, because of course, this is the month when most of the people are filing their ideas. Now that the finance minister has announced certain new measures, can the people now opt for new regime? People who especially had opted for old regime before the announcements being made by the finance minister in the parliament today?
Yeah, certainly at the time of filing your tax return, you can opt for the new tax regime. That there's no challenge.
Right. But those who have already filed, what do they do now if they want to make the switch?
So all the changes that has been, announced today in the budget, these will be applicable for the current financial year, which is 24-25, and the tax returns which getting filed is for the previous financial year, 23-24. So any which ways, all these will be effective for this year, in which we are into right now. So we have to take care while filing our tax return for the next July of 25. So at that time we have to consider this new regime or old regime.
Right. Yeah. All right.
On the budget,
yeah.
So on the budget, like we were discussing in the morning session, majboori or mazbooti.
Mazboot or majboor. What kind of a budget? Yes.
So my one-liner comment would be, थोड़ी मजबूरी के साथ मजबूत budget है ये.
Right. Mr. Singh, your final comments, and of course, how would you rate this budget out of 5?
My final comment is that this budget is clearly a budget where it's time for us to move from aspiration to acceleration, from promise to delivery, from policy to partnerships on the ground. So I would give this budget a 4 with a rider. If the announcements are not implemented and you don't get the impact on the ground, then I would make it a 3.5, because the policy announcements are very good. But even in the past, sometimes we've seen, especially when it comes to the centrally sponsored schemes, whether it was skills, whether it was, even some of the others, even Narega, for instance, great scheme, but the assets created under that need to be climate resilient and adding to the productivity of the country. On the other hand, if this is well implemented on the ground, I would give it a 4.5. So I would want to sort of, park that final score for the time being and see on how it's implemented on the ground. Excellent budget for towards the Viksit Bharat. I would have wanted to see some more innovative financing. I mentioned about blended finance. Maybe the social stock exchange needs to be sort of more activated to try and channelize the CSR funding, which could again go within the government's policy. So some of those things, they're silent on health, but then health had been covered in the interim budget. They were silent on Narega. That had been also covered in the interim budget. I would like to, also try and see more focus. They have announced a lot on energy and climate, but more focus on climate as well as we move along, because that is going to be the single biggest important issue in years to come.
All right, gentlemen, thank you for joining us here.